In this video, we're going to take a quick look at how to relocate an Emonitor database from one server and restore it to another server. It's a fairly straightforward process using SQL Server management tools. Do be aware, though, that when you're using SQL Server Backup and Restore is typically forward compatible only. So taking a database backup on a SQL 2008 system or maybe a SQL 2012 system and restoring it forward to, say, a SQL 2017 system is perfectly fine. However, doing the reverse is generally not going to work. That said, let's take a look at the short steps involved. First, let's go into the SQL Management Studio. When we open the Databases folder, we'll see the two standard Emonitor databases here, the econfig and Emonitor. Now, your database names may be different, and you may have more than one vibration database. In this case, we have econfig, which is the configuration database, and Emonitor, which is the vibration database. Now, we really only need to back up and restore the vibration database, which is the Emonitor one, but we can also do it with econfig if we want. However, it's not a requirement. So we're only going to do the vibration database today in this video, but just understand that if you want to also back up and restore and move the econfig database, you use the exact same procedure. All right, let's continue on. So to back up first the Emonitor vibration database, we'll simply right-click on Emonitor, and we'll go to Tasks, and we will say Backup. Now in the Backup Database dialog box, it's a fairly straightforward process. Do take note of the default backup destination here, which is Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server. There's a little string here for version, and then it goes to MS SQL and Backup. And then you'll see that the backup name is usually the database name with a .bak extension. So note where you will find that backup file once it's done backing up. So at this point, we don't really need to select any other options other than we are going to take a full backup. So we'll go ahead and click OK. All right, and as you can see, the database is now reflected as backup completed successfully. So that's a good indication that we're in good shape. So let's go ahead and click OK here. Okay, now that our database is backed up, we will move the file to the new target server where we can restore it. So let's jump over to that and see how that process works. Okay, this is actually the same database server I was using before, but I've removed any traces of the original databases. So it will be the same as moving to a different database server. So the first thing we need to do is go make sure we know where our BAK file is, the backup file. And in this case, we will find it where we originally created it, which is going to be in the C drive, Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server, this MS SQL 14.SQL Express, MS SQL, and then in the backup folder. Now this could just as easily be in, say, something like drive C in the root directory. So let's just move it there. And this is completely optional, obviously. All right, so now I've got a copy of it in my C drive right there. Okay, so let's go see how the restore process works. Back in our SQL Server Management Studio, we'll first go to Databases and we'll right-click on Databases, and we will choose Restore Database. Now in the Restore Database dialog box, it asks us if we're going to use a database as a source or a device. This is a little misleading terminology for most people if you're not familiar with SQL Server, but in this case we are restoring from a file that came from a different server. So we are going to choose device, not database. So device is restoring from a particular file, not an actual database on this server. So now we need to go find this file by clicking the ellipsis button here, and we will click Add. And now we need to find that BAK file. So we'll scroll up since we put it on the root of C and click on the C drive, and there's our BAK file. So we'll select it and say OK. And then we see it showing here in our backup media. We'll say OK again. All right, and we're showing that we want to restore this full database. Now notice we have an option here. It's choosing to use the database name of Emonitor since that's the name of the original database in this particular backup. At this point, we can give it a new name if we want, is completely optional. I'll just put Emonitor 2 as an example here, just so you can see. And it'll create a database called Emonitor 2 that will be an exact clone of the database that we originally backed up. If we take a quick look at the Files page, it is pulling the original file path name out of the BAK file. Now, if this particular target SQL server uses a different path, or you just want to use a different path for the data and log files, you can specify where to restore those to rather than the defaults. It will always try to use the defaults if they are there. In the case of where the new server maybe doesn't even have this original path, you will get an error if you don't point it to a valid path in the restore as column. So just be aware of that. In this case, everything should be the same, so we should be okay to click OK. So let's go ahead and do that. In the status bar on the top, you can see we're at 100% now, and we get the status pop that says Emonitor 2 restored successfully. Now we're not quite done here. You can see over here under databases, I now have an Emonitor 2 database. Now one thing I want to point out here, when Emonitor connects to a database, it needs to do so using a SQL login that we have created that maps to that database. So we have to create a SQL login here that maps to the Emonitor 2 database, and that's actually what Emonitor will refer to when it connects. When you restore a database from a different server, one thing that you really need to be aware of is that if I open this database and then come down to the security folder underneath the database itself and not the main level security folder, if I expand that, you'll see a folder called Users, as opposed to this one down here called Logins. When I expand the Users folder, you will see that there is already a user here with the original database name called Emonitor. This is what's known as an orphan user. And this will prevent us, if we don't do anything else, from using the name Emonitor down here in the main security logons folder. So if we want to use Emonitor, we have to first get rid of this one so it doesn't interfere with the new one we want to create. So we will delete this orphan Emonitor user by selecting it and hitting the delete key and then saying OK. Now that that is gone, we're free to create an actual SQL login, and that is what Emonitor can then use. So we will go ahead and say new login, and we will call this one Emonitor. Now, typically when you make these, you would match them up to whatever the database name is. In this case, Emonitor 2. But that's really just a suggestion. It's not a requirement. So in this case, I'm going to use Emonitor because that was the same name that my Emonitor clients used to connect to the database. So I will use SQL Server authentication, and that's important. I'm going to uncheck password policy. This is typically what you want to do because once Emonitor is installed, you don't want the system automatically forcing a password change and then essentially disabling all of your Emonitor clients. So typically we recommend unchecking the enforce password policy. Under default database, it needs to default to the database that Emonitor is going to use for its vibration data. So in this case, it's Emonitor 2. Now we need to go to user mapping, and we need to check the box for Emonitor 2. And then down here you can see that DB owner is already checked. That's actually potentially a problem because there is a little bug in SQL Server where when DB owner is checked the first time without you having to check it, it may actually uncheck itself when you click OK. Now I'm not sure if that's the case here, but we always want to double check that DB owner remains checked after we've done the configuration. So I'm going to say OK. Now I'm going to go back in to the Emonitor login that I've created. But before we do that, notice there's now another Emonitor user under the security folder beneath the database. And that's why we needed to remove the original one before we could create the new one down here, because it automatically creates a SQL user to pair up with the SQL login. It's a little bit confusing, but that's SQL Server for you. Let's double click on this Emonitor user to check out its configuration and make sure that it is still a DB owner. So we will go to server or user mapping, and we'll select our Emonitor 2 database, and you can see that checkbox is still there as DB owner. So that's good. That's exactly what we want. In some of the older versions, like SQL Server 2012 and 2008, frequently what would happen is you'd come back into the properties and suddenly notice that DB owner is no longer checked, and that will prevent Emonitor from being able to successfully connect to the database. In the newer version, that's not the case typically, and so usually you don't have that problem. So I'll go ahead and click OK here. And aside from the econfig database, which as you can see, we have not restored, that would be the final step to either restore or recreate the econfig database. That would be the last remaining thing that we need to do to successfully move an Emonitor system from one database server to a new database server. But that is how you move an Emonitor database to a new server. Thanks for joining us for this video. We hope to see you in the next one.